in the next couple. Okay, welcome everybody. It's absolutely marvelous to see all of you. And right before we start, I would like you to imagine that we're not here. We're not here in an online meeting. We are at a room. We're in the same room in Boston, or more precisely, Cambridge, at Harvard University, where we usually have our meetings. And we have been there for a little while. We've already had our lunch, or maybe lunch is waiting at the end of this session. And we have already had some opportunities to socialize. And as a result of this, the atmosphere in this room is congenial, informal. It's professional also, but it's marked above all by our shared interest in the development of language in children. It is marked by our curiosity in each other's works, in each other's views, and marked also by an eagerness to engage in discussion. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because I hope that you will really feel invited to pose your questions and to respond to the contributions of other people in the audience this meeting, because this is what we're used to when we're having our ProLear panel meetings. So let me first of all introduce myself, because not all of you will be familiar with me. My name is Kees Broekhoff, and I work mostly as an in-service teacher trainer for Sardis Foundation in the Netherlands, and I represent the Netherlands in the ProLear network. And Maria, maybe you would like to introduce yourself too, briefly.
Thank you, Kees. It's great to say hello to everybody from Cambridge in a very, very warm, friendly room. Actually, I am in Bogota, Colombia, but feeling there. I am the executive director of IAU2, also coordinator of ProLear Colombia. And, you know, on behalf of all our members and all of our beautiful community, just great to be here and welcome everybody, and special thanks to Anouk and to Erika for your generosity. Thank you, Kees.
Okay, thanks. Let me briefly explain the structure of this meeting. First of all, we will have Professor Erika Hoff with a presentation, which will be followed by a brief question and answer. And then we will have the same format for Anouk Ticheloven. And then we'll have some time to talk amongst ourselves in small breakout groups of 3 people. And then we will try to wind things up at 10:45 Boston time or 4:45 time in Amsterdam, Aarhus, and Hamburg. Okay, the first presenter, Professor Erika Hoff. Let me present Professor Erika Hoff to you. Professor Hoff holds the position of Professor of Psychology at Florida Atlantic University. Her research addresses the relations among properties of children's early environments, their language experience, and their language development. She has studied effects of maternal education and dual language exposure on children's language growth. Her most recent work focuses on the language development of children from Spanish-speaking homes in South Florida, and that, I'm sure, is what we're going to hear about shortly. Professor Hoff is a member of the US Bridging the Word Gap Research Network, which focuses on interventions to remedy disparities in children's early language experience. She has had continuous funding for research on bilingual development from the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development for over 10 years. Professor Hoff is the author of numerous journal articles and book chapters on the topics of environmental effects on early language development in monolingual and bilingual children. She authored the textbook Language Development, now in its 5th edition, and she is the editor of multiple books on early language development, including Research Methods in Child Language, a Practical Guide, and with Peggy McCardle, Childhood Bilingualism, Research on Infancy Through School Age. Professor Hoff has given numerous addresses to conferences and workshops all over the world, and today we have invited her to talk about language and literacy development in children of immigrant families. Professor Hoff, Erika, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you. And thank you both for inviting me to share what I know about language and literacy development with this group that meets these children on the front lines, so to speak. So I am a psychology professor. I'm telling you what I believe I know based on the research I've done, and I'm very interested in hearing your reactions to it and having the conversations that we are going to have after I'm done talking. So let me begin by saying I'm going to try to communicate 5 points, 5 things that I think the research I've been doing for the last 10 years tells me about this topic. So point number 1 is that language development in each language takes longer when 2 languages are being acquired at the same time. And this is perfectly normal. This is not a sign that the children are confused. This is not damaging to the children. Children who are developing 2 languages simultaneously are learning more than children who are acquiring only 1, but it takes them longer to do each when they're doing 2 together. The second point I want to make is that in the circumstance where a bilingual child is learning 1 language that is the majority language of the society and another language that is a minority language in that society, the typical outcome in the United States, at least, is that the child becomes dominant in the societal language. It takes some children longer to reach that point than others, depending upon how much of the minority language they hear at home, but dominance in the societal language is the typical outcome. However, just because a child is dominant in the societal or majority language does not mean that that child is at the same level that that child would be at if he were only learning 1 language. So a dominant language in a bilingual child is not the same thing as the only language in a monolingual child. Okay, the third point, because I was asked to say something about this, and in my data, preschool attendance does not help children learn language. Now, I know there are many studies that find preschool attendance does, and I think the explanation for the disparity in findings is that school attendance helps majority language development if the school is high quality, but not if the school is not high quality. And I'll be happy to talk more about that when we have our conversations. Then the last 2 points have to do with literacy. It's clear, as everybody knows, that spoken language skills are the foundation for literacy. But what my data say is that the relation between oral language skills and reading ability is language specific. That is, oral language skills in Spanish help reading in Spanish, and oral language skills in English help reading in English. And there is not really cross-linguistic support at the level of vocabulary. You do, however, and this is my last point, you do see that children's reading skills in 2 languages are strongly related. But it's not because vocabulary in Spanish is helping the children to read in English. It is because reading skills, there is something to do with reading skills per se, and they transfer from 1 language to another. So if you know how to read in 1 language and then you learn a second language, you will know how to read in that language if they are both alphabetic languages. But that's not the same thing as saying that your oral language skills have a cross-linguistic benefit. So now I'm going to go through a few slides and try to tell you something about the empirical findings that are the basis for these points that I've outlined. So first, this is the source of the data for the past more than 10 years. My colleagues and students and I have been doing a study of the dual language development of children in the United States who hear Spanish and English at home. Some of them hear only Spanish at home initially, but very quickly English sort of comes in through the cracks in the windows. So these are children who have dual language exposure, if not from birth, from very shortly after birth. And the question is, what does that dual language exposure look like at home? And what does their development of English and Spanish oral language skills and literacy look like? And so here's what we found. Sorry, first I'll tell you a little bit more about the procedure. We have roughly 130 children who come from Spanish-speaking homes who are developing bilingually. We have in the sample also about 35 children, and I say about because it depends upon what analysis we're doing, exactly how many kids we have data for. But we have a comparison group of children who come from monolingual English homes. We started studying these children when they were 2.5 years old. We visited the children and the primary caregiver almost always in their homes every 6 months between 2.5 and 5 years. Starting at 5 years, we then have annual visits up to the age of 12 years. So that's where my data come from. In our home visits, we interviewed the mothers extensively. It was almost always mothers, but the definition was primary caregiver. We interviewed the caregivers extensively to ask about who lives in the home, what languages they use, and then we administered several standardized assessments of the children's language skill. So that's the source of my data. Here's the first piece of evidence. So if we follow these children from 2.5 to 5 years, the graph on the left-hand side shows you the estimated growth curves for English. For children who, in the dotted line on top, these are children who have monolingual exposure. So if your exposure to English is 100% of your exposure, whatever that may be, your mother talks a lot, your mother talks a little, averaged across that sort of variability, we compare growth for English in children who hear only English and growth for English in children who hear 50% English and 50% Spanish. And there is a significant difference at every point along the way. If you look even younger, that's not up on the screen, but I have looked at younger children. If you start at a younger age, you see that English is actually growing more rapidly. The slope is steeper English is growing more rapidly in the monolinguals than it is in the bilinguals. And now turning to the other graph, so these are the same bilingual children. The children who hear only English are no longer in this graph. And we've plotted the growth curves for the same children in English and in Spanish. And what you see here is for children who hear 50-50 bilingual exposure at home. So their input is evenly divided. And now this is an estimated growth curve. It's not to say that we have a whole lot of children who get exactly that input. But what the data tell us is that what you would predict for a child who gets perfectly balanced input in the circumstances of the children in this study, that is living in the United States, English grows significantly faster than Spanish. And that's the basis on which I say Spanish is not so pervasive in Florida as monolingual speakers of English think it is. Spanish is not as dominant as the reputation of South Florida. Even Spanish-speaking parents living in South Florida have a hard time maintaining Spanish proficiency in their children. And that's one of our clear findings. Okay, this is the same set of children at the age of 5. And now what this graph shows you, the question is, what kind of bilinguals do these kids turn out to be at the age of 5? Are they balanced bilinguals? Are they English dominant? And then the other parameter apart from balance or dominance is how advanced are they all together? And we measure this, this graph just shows measuring language acquisition in terms of a vocabulary score on a standardized test. But what you see in the 4 profiles for where there are blue and gray bars, what you see is there are different kinds of bilinguals among these children. Some have stronger skills and some have weaker skills. Some are more nearly balanced, like if you look at this profile, 2 and 4, these children are pretty nearly balanced. They're a little bit stronger in English than in Spanish, but not too much. And then another profile is to be extremely dominant in English and have really fairly low Spanish scores. And we've done analyses to find out, what background variables predict what profile children are going to be in. But the point I want to make from this graph today is there really is no profile in which children are Spanish dominant. Children who live in the United States and come from Spanish speaking homes, if they also hear English to some degree, they become English dominant. In my sample, they become dominant by 5. Other people have studied children who come from really they only hear Spanish at home, and they may be Spanish dominant when they start school. And so they look like this after the 1st grade or the 2nd grade. But you really do not see children born in the United States who don't learn English. You do see children born in the United States to Spanish-speaking families who don't learn Spanish. That happens all the time. The other point to make from this graph is this is the score, the mean score on the same test for the children who are English monolinguals. And they are significantly above the bilingual groups. And that story stays the same even if you control for parents' level of education. So it remains the case at the age of 5 that if you are learning 2 languages at the same time, you can see if you add these scores, which is psychometrically not quite kosher, but if you add these scores, you can see these bilingual children know more language than the monolingual children, but they do not know as much English as the monolingual children. And that's a fact that comes up again and again in our studies. Okay. Now, what about preschool? What if these children were sent to preschool? Would that make their English skills better? Would that wash out the differences due to their home language exposure? And the answer in our data is no. So the way you look at this graph is here on this side, we've plotted English vocabulary scores. On this side, Spanish vocabulary scores. So you can see these are the same children. This is at the age of 4.5 now. So across everything, they are stronger in English than they are in Spanish. These 3 bars show children who have relatively low levels of exposure to English at home. These children have higher levels of exposure to English at home. And again, you can see that the kids with higher exposure know more English, and the kids with higher exposure to English and less exposure to Spanish know less Spanish. The effect of preschool is in these 3 different bars, and you can see that there's really virtually nothing there. The story is that preschool is neither good nor bad for the children's English. The significant predictor is what they hear at home. Now, I don't think that's a logical necessity. I think it has to do with the fact that I haven't gone into these children's preschool. So what I'm saying is based on what other researchers tell me. But in preschools in South Florida, most of the workers are Spanish-speaking immigrants, and they use a lot of Spanish in the classroom, even though the language of the curriculum is English, and they are required to use English for their teaching, such as the teaching is in preschool. But many of them have very low proficiency in English. And that's simply a fact about how much we pay and what we require in terms of credentials for the people who work with our children in early care and education settings. So again, preschool exposure can support English language development or the development of any other language you want, but you can't automatically count on it doing it. It depends upon quality. And truth be told, that's true for monolingual English children too. Does going to school help their language development? Well, it depends very much on the quality of the preschool. It does not automatically have a benefit just by sending the child out into a school environment. Okay, now we're going to look a little bit older and just tell you a little bit of what we're learning about these children as they start to learn how to read. And what this graph tells you is that English vocabulary at 5 years predicts English reading comprehension over the age range from 6 to 9. So again, these are the same sample of bilingual children. We gave them a vocabulary test. This is the expressive one-word picture vocabulary. No, this is the Woodcock-Johnson. Sorry, I have to take that back. This is the Woodcock-Johnson picture naming task. So it's a widely used and validated measure of English expressive vocabulary. And the children who are high in English vocabulary have better reading comprehension than the children who are low in English vocabulary. Now, the next picture I'm going to show you is not statistically drawn. It is my hand-drawn picture of the results. But what we did for these same children, we also measured their vocabulary size in Spanish. And we also gave them a reading test in Spanish. And that was sort of a weird thing to do because these children go to school only in English. None of the children in our sample go to a bilingual school starting in kindergarten. Their school-based instruction is entirely in English, but they speak both English and Spanish to some degree. And so we asked them to take the reading comprehension test in Spanish. And some of them said to us, no, I don't know how to read in Spanish. And then we say, well, just, try, see what happens. And lo and behold, they can read in Spanish. They didn't know it. But here's what you see. And this is my last slide. If you measure children's English vocabulary at 5 years, it's a significant predictor of their English reading comprehension. And that's the previous graph that I showed you. What's also true is if you measure their Spanish vocabulary, it is a significant predictor of their Spanish reading comprehension. But Spanish vocabulary in these children who are English dominant does not predict English reading, and English vocabulary does not predict Spanish reading. And this picture is a mistake because there should be double, this line should have arrows on both sides. That is, this is just a plain old correlation between the height of the English reading growth curve and the height of the Spanish reading growth curve, and it's a significant correlation. So it's my inference that this reflects transfer of English reading ability to Spanish. And I give that interpretation to a correlation between measures that are taken at the same time, because these children are taught how to read in English. They are not taught how to read in Spanish. So they know how to read in Spanish only to the extent that it's obvious from knowing Spanish vocabulary, plus obvious from knowing the alphabetic principle and the sound letter correspondences from English. So this is the basis for my claim that oral language skill, at least at the vocabulary level, phonology may very well transfer, but vocabulary knowledge in one language doesn't help you understand what you read in another language. But knowing how to read in one language can help you know how to read in another language. And I think that may be a finding with important practical implications. That is, if children are very good in Spanish, unlike the children in my study, I call them my children, but they're not. if you have children who are very good in Spanish and very weak in English, they're going to have a hard time learning to read in English. And this graph should work the other direction for children who are strong in Spanish vocabulary and oral language skills. Teaching them to read in Spanish should be far more successful, and those skills will transfer to English. At least that's what my data suggests. So to sum up, bilingual children have different language experiences than monolingual children. And as a result, they have different language skills. It would be strange if it were otherwise. Language acquisition is a learning process. It is not just a maturation process, and learning depends upon experience. What we also seem to find in our data is that children will be stronger readers in the language that they know better, and that reading skills acquired in one language will transfer to reading in another language. And on that note, thank you very much. And I'm happy to do whatever you do next. Questions, breakout groups, whatever you would like.
Thank you very much, Erica. That was really very, very interesting. I think most of us will recognize the need for a high quality preschool education. But the other the correlations that you showed are really very enlightening, and I'm very happy to see all that. I have myself a clarifying question about slide number 8, where you showed the positive effect of English vocabulary knowledge at 5 years on the growth of English reading comprehension in bilingual. The line of the graph seems to flatten. What's the explanation for that? Is the role of vocabulary does it decrease in the course of time?
No, those two parallel curved lines have nothing to do, that is, the shape of those lines don't reflect the predictive relation between vocabulary and reading. Those are just two growth curves, one estimated for children with English vocabularies in the 75th percentile for the sample, and the other growth curve for children with English vocabularies in the 25th percentile for the sample. What the curvature of those lines tells you is that children make progress faster initially, and the rate at which their reading comprehension improves slows down as they become better readers. You could say it's a function of the instrument, but in general, when a process starts, you make faster progress initially, and then vocabulary growth shows the same sort of quadratic effect of it. It is faster initially, and then it's still growing, they're still improving, but they're improving at a slower rate. That's what the shape of those curves has to do with. It is the difference in elevation of those two curves. It's the gap between those two curves that is what's predicted by vocabulary knowledge.
Okay, yes, I see. Okay, thanks. Okay, are there any other questions? I'm looking at the chat. Anyone who wants to ask a question through the microphone or on the chat? There's one question in the chat that I see that has to do with the quality of preschools, and that's something I was wondering about myself. Low quality preschools do not have an effect on language acquisition, right? On the growth of language competence. Now, low language quality in the homes still results in language growth, even though it may not be spectacular, but children acquire language even if there is a low quality of language in the homes. Why should this not be the case in preschools where there is low quality? Why shouldn't there still be some growth?
Well, first of all, when we say preschool doesn't, no, I'm sorry, I'm really sort of thinking out loud, because it's an interesting question, and I don't usually talk a whole lot about the null preschool results. Children who go to preschool do not develop English at a faster rate than children who don't go to preschool. And all of what that means is that the children in preschool are not getting better English input than the children who are staying at home. It doesn't mean that they have silence and their growth is only a function of what they hear at home. It simply means that even if you come from a Spanish-speaking home and you only hear English, say 40% of the time at home, and you go to an English preschool, that English preschool is not going to be any better than staying home where you're getting 40% English. And the reasons for that are pretty clear in studies of preschool quality. So for example, and this is not my research, I'm telling you research in the literature, and in fact, the people that I work with here in Denmark are major researchers in that field. In preschool, one important predictor identified a long time ago is the amount of time a child spends in one-to-one conversation with an adult. Well, that doesn't happen a whole lot in many preschools. And there's a whole science to studying the quality of the interactions that occur in preschools and how those can better support language acquisition, both for monolingual and bilingual children. But the data that I presented don't mean that the children are getting nothing at preschool. It means they're not getting anything more than the kids who are staying home.
Yeah, it's clear. Thank you very much. Yes, I think what you're telling us also is in line with what we've been discussing in previous sessions about research conducted by Catherine Snow and Meredith Rowe, where the quality of the conversations one-to-one or in a very small group is so of overriding importance for the language development of children. Yes, we know that. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Because if not, I think...
Yes, Andrea has
Yes, Andrea? Okay.
Yes. Hi, Erica. Yeah,
Hi.
Andrea Rolla. I just had a question about what recommendations you have for balanced bilinguals. Thinking about considering the research that you've done, just not just thinking about children who eventually, it sounds like you're telling the story of how they will be English dominant, but what recommendations can we make to families, to schools about how we can make sure that children are at grade level in English, because it looks like they're lagging behind the monolingual English speakers, but also how can we help them try to maintain their Spanish? Okay.
It's clear from my data that what supports that the children who are the highest, have the highest vocabulary scores in both languages and are the most balanced. What's different about them from the rest of the children is the amount of Spanish they hear at home. They hear a lot, and their mother's level of education in Spanish. So one of the things we've discovered in our data is that so there's tons and tons of evidence that maternal education predicts children's language. And, it could be that just maternal education is a marker for a socioeconomic status and all sorts of things in the children's environment. Well, what my data say is that actually maternal education is a marker for the quality of the language that the mother uses, because if we look at our mothers of our bilingual children, their level of educational attainment in Spanish predicts their children's Spanish, and their level of education in English predicts their children's English, and not vice versa. So these children who are strong in Spanish have a lot of high quality Spanish exposure at home. Now, these kids are also strong in English, and some of that has to do with ability. There are individual differences in language learning ability. We measure it, our measures that are arguably indicators of that are phonological memory skill. I didn't talk about it, but all of these children were administered a phonological memory task, and that predicts their total vocabulary. And this is kind of a long topic to explain, but nonverbal IQ predicts English. So that's a lot of little pieces of data, but to try and go back and answer your question, how do you get children to be balanced bilinguals? Because that's a goal of many, many families, and it's a laudable goal, and yet not lag behind monolingual children in the societal language. And my answer to that is, first of all, you have to recognize that children who are learning 2 languages are learning more than children who are learning 1. Second, you have to recognize that language learning depends on experience. So if you're going to do more of something that depends on experience, you're going to have more experience. So the children are only going to acquire Spanish to the extent that they have lots of experience and high quality experience in Spanish. But then for them to not be disadvantaged in English, you have to give them extra English. That is, they need a richer language environment. And of course, there's only so many hours in the day. So it's all the more important that the language exposure bilingual children get be of high quality. So you need a very rich language environment. And it's not impossible. That is, it takes longer for children to learn 2 languages than to learn 1, but it doesn't take twice as long. There are economies, there is transfer. The task of learning 2 languages is not double the task of learning 1 language. Lots of things transfer. The details depend upon the particular languages, of course. And this is not my data. Ellen Thorderdottir has, I think, some very compelling data that the effects of exposure are not linear. So the difference between 50% exposure and 60% exposure, that has a bigger effect on the child's language development than the difference between 80% exposure and 90% exposure. So the trade-offs are, it's not a complete trade-off of if I'm not speaking Spanish, then, I mean, if I'm speaking English and I'm not speaking Spanish, and you can't help one without hurting the other. The kids are doing more and they need more input and they need a richer language environment to come closer to monolingual levels. And it can be done, but it requires a very, very rich environment. Having said all that, what I just said is an extrapolation from my data. I have very few children who look like that. In the United States, English swamps everything. Another finding we have that I didn't present is that if you look at these children over time and ask, how do their language skills at one point predict their growth over the next 6 months? What you find is that the better they are in English, the less Spanish they learn going forward. But the opposite is not true. Knowing Spanish does not interfere with learning English in the United States, but knowing English does interfere with learning Spanish in the United States. So the processes that determine the outcome of dual language exposure don't just happen inside of the head of the child. A lot of these processes have to do with the societal use of English. And again, it seems to me like there's a lot of Spanish in South Florida, and compared to Kansas, there is, but not compared to Peru. And for children to, and the other thing is these children don't go to school in Spanish. So how much English would I know if I only stayed home and talked about home things and never read a book? And so language acquisition is something that happens over the course of your life. And so for parents to think, well, I'll use Spanish at home and then my child's going to be fluent in Spanish and their Spanish is going to be as good as their English. It's not realistic. If you really study the acquisition of any language and you see how much experience the child has and how much all the different aspects of experience, both in school and out of school, and by in school, I mean the literacy and the academic language, the idea that you could, talk to a child for their first 4 years and then they would be like a monolingual speaker, it doesn't make sense and it doesn't happen. So in the United States, I don't have any of those mythical, perfectly balanced, high functioning into language bilinguals that I've been saying are possible. I think they should be possible, but the United States does not provide the environment for that, for sure.
Erica, you made a reference to Peru. There is a question in the chat about this, about a third language. In Peru, rural children learn Quechua at home, Spanish at school, and in first grade start English. Does this complicate matters even further? Is this third language a complicating factor in the acquisition of literacy development?
It's complicating. Is it damaging? I would never say that, but it's certainly complicating. Again, in my sample, we certainly see children who hear a third indigenous language at home, and we don't include them because it's complicating. Children do that. Now, I will say, if you study adult bilinguals, and in my lab, we've done one study of adult bilinguals, so I'm really talking about the literature as a whole. It is rare to find even perfectly balanced, highly competent bilingual speakers. Most bilingual speakers will say they're better in one language than the other. And for trilingual, I really don't know the literature, and I know it's a smaller literature on trilinguals, but I guess I would retreat to what Grosjean said a long time ago. Bilinguals and multilinguals know each language to the extent that their environment requires them to know it for the uses that they put that language to. And so trilingual doesn't mean monolingual like speaker in 3 languages, and bilingual doesn't mean monolingual like speaker in 2 languages. That's not a typical outcome of exposure to multiple languages, because typically when one is exposed to multiple languages, you are exposed to them in different amounts and in different circumstances, and different circumstances demand different vocabulary and different styles of language use and different syntactic structures. And so you're not, I would say ever, that's kind of a strong statement, but it's not likely that anybody's circumstance is going to support the same sort of competence across multiple languages. Is that complicated? To be sure. Is that bad? I think that's a silly question. Some people can choose to be bilingual. I could choose to send my child to, a Mandarin bilingual school, but the families that I study who are bilingual didn't sit down and decide, oh, wouldn't it be nice to emigrate from South America and still speak Spanish? I mean, they speak Spanish and they live in the United States, and that's why their children are bilingual, and it's their circumstance. So the question is how to make best use of that circumstance and how to profit from the richness in the circumstance, not is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? And yeah, complicated, but complicated doesn't mean bad. It makes it hard to study, for sure.
Yeah, I know, yeah. We have studies like that in the Netherlands, where some children speak Frisian at home, Dutch at school, and learn English in school. And this is the same kind of situation with overall pretty good outcomes in all 3 languages, but not all the same. Yeah, that's right. Okay, thank you very much, Erica. There is one other question, but I would like to leave that aside for
Sure.
the breakout group, because I know that Anouk is really waiting now to get started. And I would like to introduce Anouk. Maria, do you have anything to add or anything to say at this point? I would like to give the floor to Anouk after.
No, please. I want to hear her too.
No, but I saw a hand with Maria.
Oh, no.
Okay, Anouk. Anouk Ticheloven from the University of Hamburg. Anouk Ticheloven studied educational sciences at Utrecht University in the Netherlands and is now a PhD student at Hamburg University in Germany. She is interested in multilingualism and currently involved in the project Multilingual Development, a longitudinal perspective at Hamburg University. Anouk aims to highlight child and youth perspectives on and experiences with growing up in a multilingual context. In particular, she has focused on practical challenges of pedagogical approaches that intend to include and validate multiple languages in multilingual classrooms. In her PhD project, she explores how multilingual competence may be related to adolescents' emotional well-being. Besides research, she teaches bachelor pre-service teachers about migration-led diversity and multilingualism in the classroom. Well, this is a very interesting addition, I would say, to the presentation that we just had, in that it really focuses on what to do with multilingual children in the classroom, and in particular, when there are more than 2 languages present. Anouk, I give you the floor.
Thank you so much for this introduction. I'm very glad to talk today about translanguaging challenges in multilingual classrooms. And Kees introduced me already. I studied in Utrecht and I'm right now working in Hamburg University, and I'll talk about an article I published together with my supervisors, Professor Elma Blom and Professor Paul Lezeman, and a colleague here in Hamburg, Dr. Sarah McMonagle, about translanguaging challenges in multilingual classrooms from scholar, teacher, and student perspectives. And first of all, I would like to kind of sketch the context. So we're talking about linguistically diverse classroom climates where children bring many different languages with them, speak many different languages at home, and they're rather multilingual contexts and not really bilingual contexts. So I had a lot of statistics. I'm showing only 2, and I think it will make the point. In the Netherlands, 1 out of 4 persons have a migration background, and over half of the children in primary school in Hamburg have a migration background. And as you can see in this figure, in the Netherlands, the 6 biggest immigration groups are people from Turkey, Morocco, Suriname, Indonesia, Germany, Poland, and this list is way longer. So this makes a lot of sense. There are people from different African, Asian countries, and many different countries also in Europe. So we have a lot of linguistic diversity. I would like to talk about translanguaging. There are many different definitions of translanguaging, and one of the definitions is a psycholinguistic definition which talks about individuals, so the ability of multilingual speakers to shuttle very easily between languages without regard for socially and politically defined boundaries, like you can also see here. And there are a couple of researchers and people that want to take this a step further and are actually advocating for translanguaging pedagogy. And one of the influencers in this field of translanguaging as pedagogy is Ofelia Garcia. And here I have a quote from a child that was saying, "English runs through my veins while Spanish is in my heart." And a reaction of Ofelia Garcia was, for example, what kind of damage are we doing to a child if we remove one of those components? So what does it mean, a translanguaging pedagogy? In a translanguaging pedagogy, learners are seen as co-creators of knowledge. They bring knowledge with them to the classroom because they speak other home languages, and they have skills in those languages. And it's based on the idea that each language can be a resource for learning, but also for identity development and emotional and socio-emotional development. And how teachers do this, they can use scaffolding strategies and scaffolding techniques, as is also demonstrated here in the figure. The educational principle is a ground-up pedagogy, like bottom-up, what children are already capable of. In this case of translanguaging and multilingualism, we're talking about home language use. They can alternate between languages, use full linguistic repertoires. And what teachers can do is teach for cross-linguistic transfer, like make language comparisons, or just empower to use home languages, and or if it's logistically possible, because sometimes there's just one kid or student that speaks a respective language, teachers can organize collaborations in home languages, or where also home languages can be used. Translanguaging as pedagogy is based on the idea or in the belief that it is very useful to invest in all languages in students' linguistic repertoire, not necessarily in school, but at least that in schools. And this is stimulated and encouraged. As you can see here in the additive approach, when you speak a certain language at home, here Kosa, you come to school, you learn new languages like the language of schooling, but this doesn't mean that Kosa cannot develop any further. So ideally in language translanguaging idea, you develop or you invest in the languages, at least this would not be harmful, is the idea. So why a translanguaging pedagogy? Why are people advocating for this? It's against social inequality and educational inequality. There is data about, yes, oh, sorry, I heard something, but it's against stigma. So there multilingualism when it's about English as another home language, or Spanish or French, then this is very prestigious, this is nice. But when it's about unknown African languages, or maybe languages with less prestige, there is stigma, there's sometimes discrimination or even institutional discrimination. And translanguaging pedagogy is pro empowered identity development. Languages are part of you is the idea. So it's nice to integrate all those languages in your identity if this is important for a child. In translanguaging pedagogies, language is seen as a human right, and strong heritage language proficiency is seen as something that should be encouraged in any language. So not only the prestigious languages. Furthermore, a goal of translanguaging pedagogy can be to close gaps between life worlds. Now I'm talking about home and school life worlds, but also life worlds of people that grow up with different languages in different cultures. And the idea is, ideologically speaking, that it can be a benefit for all students to learn about other languages, to learn about other cultures, also when you do not grow up with many languages. So very briefly, I'll show some examples from a project I was working in Hamburg, making languages visible. Also in the Netherlands, there's the language friendly school, writing multilingual poems, work with different languages. Even when the teacher doesn't speak languages, you can use also parents or ask parents to help with such kind of things. Writing multilingual books. There are way more examples, but I'm showing just 3. But then there is this risk that translanguaging pedagogies in a multilingual context risk being romanticized or being too ideological. It sounds all very nice, but how do you do this? When do you do this? And is this even possible? And does it even bring something? So the study I'm talking about was following the research question: what are perceived and expected constraints and opportunities of a translanguaging pedagogy in a multilingual context, according to scholars, teachers, and multilingual students. And I did interviews with them. Each interview was different because we were also talking about what we discussed in previous interviews, and I was also visiting schools, and we discussed also things that happened in the school. So it was an iterative design, to say so. And in my results, we could distinguish 7 debates, which I would like to discuss with you now. I would like to point out here that many of the participants were very positive about this idea of translanguaging, and I am really focusing also due to time on challenges. Not that you have the idea that it is more negative than you think, but of course there are challenges, and if you would want to use this translanguaging, you have to talk about the challenges and how you could solve this or not. So a first debate is about side effects. This is about the fear of teachers and students that when you include languages that not everybody speaks, students can use this language to exclude other people, to gossip. Teachers do not know if students are actually working or not. So there is this fear of losing control. So here, this is also explained a little bit by some students. They are saying, yeah, there are two guys in grade 7 who are also Spanish, and we also always speak Spanish. And then when there are people who don't speak Spanish, and this girl reacts, you still speak Spanish. Yeah, sometimes when we're with them in a conversation, we kind of try to also speak Spanish with them. And then this girl reacts, hola, like she wants to show that she speaks some Spanish. And the boy reacts, no, we speak English when we're in a conversation with them. Of course we do. And then there was a quite long silence. Well, we mix. So the children themselves are also saying that they're not always speaking the language that everybody speaks. But the question is, how bad is this? There was a scholar with teaching experience who said that a parent complained because the teacher allowed other languages during break time. Her kid was the only Bulgarian in the group, did not understand a word of what other kids were saying. But then another scholar reacted to this by saying that at the end of the day, it's all about being caring and respectful, and that's it. And as long as you drum that in, there's no need for specific rules about languages. So this is debate number 1. Then we go to debate number 2. Goal formulation. So this was a debate about why would you do translanguaging, or why would you use a translanguaging pedagogy for learning, or just for some kind of celebrating and encouraging languages and validation and stuff like that. So students themselves, some of them also believed it could help them in learning. So one student said, I think it's pretty much fun to do, and I think we can learn more. First, I say it like in English and then in my other language, and then it just sticks in my head because I thought of it in 2 languages. Another student also expressed that she really loved it because normally if you don't know something, you're just like, whatever, let it go. But now you can really, really discuss it. But there was also the other side of the coin that maybe students do not want to do this. So one student said, and I maybe do want to use my other languages, but when I have the feeling that I have to use them, I get tired. This is also this topic of agency, like, yeah, it's kind of normal in this age of 11, probably. But yeah, then also a scholar reacted. Sometimes what happens is that teachers plan for it and then students do not react so much. Maybe some students don't want to speak their home language, but can also be, this was also part of the debate, it can also be that they cannot really contribute in their home language, especially when they were born in the respective country and are maybe stronger in the language of schooling in that domain. It's also Erica was describing. So this was the second debate. The third debate is related to this, was about learning the language of schooling. So this is a very important thing, and also everybody agrees about this. It's important to learn the language of schooling for educational success and later career success. But there are 2 fears here. So if you use heritage and home languages, one teacher said, to be completely honest now, I fear that it's counterproductive for the learning process of the Arabic speaking students that you speak their language, like one teacher said, because they are not being forced to learn the language of schooling because they could speak Arabic with the teacher that spoke Arabic. But then another teacher said, you don't want students who feel trapped in an environment in which they feel they cannot express themselves. So there is this fear on the one hand that you're not pushed enough to learn the language of schooling, and on the other hand, unengaged students who cannot express. And this also has to do a lot with the level of schooling language they already have, the students. And then part of this debate was also how important it is to actually be fluent in the language of schooling for learning. So one teacher said, somehow 2 Greek girls are not in the extra program with more Dutch language support, but just in the regular program. No idea why. Then I realized at some point, wow, how bad your Dutch actually still is. But they're really getting away with it. Yeah, in Dutch assessments, I see their Dutch is really, really bad, but they can somehow deal with it in the regular program. So this was also a discussion for newcomers, like how important is it for content learning that they know this language of schooling. So this was another debate. I'll skip to the next one. This was about English and other semiotic resources, so other ways of making meaning, like also figures and stuff like that. And the study I did in the Netherlands and in Germany, and people there speak German and Dutch, but there were a couple of students that addressed the idea that they didn't understand why they couldn't just learn English. It feels like English defines me. It feels like home. I really love to express myself in English. I don't know why. I mean, English is the most important language of the planet. How can you not want to learn that language? So there were some students that were saying this, that they wanted to learn English or to use English as a lingua franca, but there were a couple of teachers that were saying that this doesn't make all too much sense, because in the end, language of schooling is Dutch or German. And on top of that, often they don't even speak English so well. So English is sometimes even seen as an enemy in this context by some people. Then there was a debate about effective functions, and everybody agreed here that emotions are very important, but there was a difference in what kind of emotions. So there was one teacher that said, of course, we see that students cannot do without their own languages. When they are sad, when they're having a fight, this involves emotions. And then we find a solution, and then it's really no problem when they use their own language. So this teacher really stressed this feeling sad, and you need your language when you're not feeling well. But students themselves expressed that they kind of wanted their language when they were trying to make friends, and they wanted to make a joke. So one student said, when we first moved, the school principal kind of forbade us to talk to each other in our mother tongue, which was so freaking unfair. We just moved there. None of us had friends. None of us could talk or express ourselves. Frankly speaking, I don't think the teachers gave a damn. So she was saying that she was feeling really bad about not being able to make friends, although there were people around that spoke the same language as she did. And another student said, I miss my mother tongue when I want to make a joke. So also, and unlike the teacher who was focusing on negative emotions, where of course it's also important. Then the sixth debate is about students who are already fluent in the language of schooling, and they still have that heritage language or that home language that they like and maybe want to use. But is it worth effort? Because in the end, the tests in school are in the language of schooling. And then there was also a debate between teachers about this. One teacher was saying, yes, of course, that takes time, but I think that's education and not running through the curriculum. My students always pass their exams. And also, a student was explaining this a little bit better, that in using the heritage language or the home language, was actually a lot of effort. So it's nice. He wanted to further invest in it, but he said, for example, my mother sometimes texts me in Bosnian, but spelling is something completely different. I always reply in Dutch, which she perfectly understands as well. So in education, this is kind of the same thing. Some students are just stronger in the language of schooling, and even though they want to learn that other language, it's kind of a lot of effort. But then another student also said it's a lot of work, but if I can use my Danish for my homework, I still have a little bit from home. So there was a debate about how much it's worth the effort. The last debate is about confusion. Students had different views on this. So one student, for example, said, when I'm using all the languages at once, my brain just goes like, she said she got very confused, and she was not the only one. Another student said, mixing languages, oh, that's me, I do it all the time. And also she was not the only one. So there were really differences between students here. And a teacher addressed this and by saying, as we saw this week, it does confuse some of the students. And why is it always good to put them in that confusion? Some students would thrive on confusion because it makes them work it out and learn more. And some students, and I would have been one of them, would just drown. And as teacher, you need to make sure that you cater to both of those different types of students. And then this debate is also going on, and a scholar reacted to this, that this confusion is maybe a skill, so that it's not so bad. We cannot always guess what language the other person is going to speak. The problem is that a lot of linguistics and language teaching want to teach predictability. So the scholar was saying this confusion is maybe could be beneficial for life skills and learning. So I presented very briefly the debates that we discussed. And I think in conclusion, I can say linguistic diversity creates pedagogical challenges. And if you want to do something like a translanguaging pedagogy, there will be challenges because every context is different. And it may be an idea to find solutions together with students, scholars, and teachers to maybe reach this final goal, systematic and purposeful translanguaging as part of a multilingual school culture. This was my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'm curious to hear any questions.
Thank you very much. I know that's very interesting to see all these different perspectives on translanguaging as a pedagogy for dealing with multilingualism in schools. These 7 issues for debate that you presented, it's quite obvious all these issues need to be addressed if you want to arrive at a systematic approach. Are there any examples where this systematic approach has already been realized? Does it actually exist, or is it still experimental, intuitive? Can you tell us a bit more about that? I'm so curious to know that.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think, yes, the answer is yes. There's a lot of research projects that are working on this and trying to implement it. And they are trying to work with teachers and letting teachers decide themselves, for example, how they can integrate languages or how they can give languages a place in education. Also here at Hamburg University, there are a couple of projects, for example, that are working on that. Also in the United States, I know there are projects that are trying to implement such things and doing ethnographic research studies about it and interview studies. So I don't think it's only ideological. People are really doing this, yes.
Okay. There's a question in the chat asking, would you have any recommendations for educational leaders to be open and adapt curricula towards translanguaging? Because I'm sure that the people you interviewed were probably all in schools where this was already more or less accepted, or at least they were trying things. But if I look at practice in the Netherlands, generally, there is still a lot of opposition towards the use of home languages or heritage languages in school. How can we persuade people to be more open towards this?
Yeah, indeed. As you rightfully point out, there are more schools that are not doing this than schools that are doing this. And the schools where I was for this project were super diverse schools, international schools, and schools that had many newcomers from many different countries. And even if they didn't want it, if they didn't believe it, maybe from their philosophy, they were kind of forced to deal with the languages. So that's on the one hand. And I think on the other hand, there are people working on how can you do this in a school where there is still this monolingual belief and this monolingual prestige and not really a place for home languages. What I would say to school leaders, I think there's a lot of work on this. There's, for example, this language-friendly school that is trying to help schools in that, and also to take the different steps, like maybe start with making languages visible, but mostly to see what kind of students you have. Are they newcomers? Are they still super fluent in their heritage language? Like that's kind of their dominant language, or are they already language of schooling dominant? So also just to kind of tailor the translanguaging to the situation you have, because each multilingual school is different in that way.
That's the main challenge, probably, to tailor the translanguaging approach exactly to the population that you have.
Yes, and I think teachers know that best because they know their children and they know their needs, and this requires a lot of collaboration with teachers and not only research.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. There aren't any further questions in the chat, so I think it's a good time now to split up in small breakout groups, so we all have an opportunity to speak our minds about what we've been hearing from Erica and from Anouk and from the discussions that we had. We will, Maria, I give you the floor for the instructions for the breakout groups.
Thank you, Kies, and thank you to Erica and Anouk for such a interesting, very provoking talk presentations. We are inviting now to break up into small groups of 3 people, more or less, and connect to this, I think, very important question that relates actually to what Kies you just brought up, and Anouk also, that has to be with how we engage teachers into these mindsets. For example, in IU2, we have right now in one of our schools a classroom of 18 children and 4 different languages spoken. And it's very important for us always to understand what kind of tools or what kind of competencies we need to develop as teachers to embrace this. So let's go out into the groups and think, how should a teacher professional development be designed in order to equip teachers better to deal with bilingual populations? What kind of tools, what should we do? And let's get together then for 15 minutes, and then we will come back and briefly, share our thoughts on this. Okay, so Lore or Kies?
Okay.
Break out.
Would like to know. Okay. I am practically sure that all of you have had some experience with translanguaging in the past 15 minutes, have you or haven't you? I mean, I have. We've spoken Spanish and English. I myself, just English. And then we had Claudia Perano, who spoke English and Spanish. And we had Gary Escalante, who spoke just Spanish. Now, this was very, very interesting because it was an example of how translanguaging can work in order to communicate, because we had terrific communication and we had 2 languages and we had different modes. That was very interesting. I'm interested to hear from 1 or 2 groups that spoke just in Spanish, and to hear from them what a relief it was to be able to speak in Spanish and not to have to speak in English that maybe you're not very good at, or even if you're good at it. Give me something.
So let's hear from one of the groups that only spoke in Spanish. We actually ended up speaking in English all the time.
I was actually in a group where we spoke Spanish, and I didn't even realize until halfway when we were speaking that, oh, we're all speaking Spanish. It was really interesting. And 2 of the people that were in the group were educators themselves. So one of the things that they share is the fact that maybe one of the things that we can do about is maybe finding acceptance in the different languages that are brought into the classrooms and use the main language as a unifying language rather than excluding a element.
Mm-hmm. And Rosario, can you tell us a bit more about what it was like to share your ideas in Spanish and now to report them in English?
I am happy to, or not happy maybe, but report that there are some terminologies that I know in English more than Spanish, so it was a little bit of mixing, and I apologize to the people that were in the group with me. But it is I don't know, there is some level of proficiency in which it allows you to, without even thinking about it, you switch from one language to the other. But I will share that it was very comforting to be able to speak in my native language and share, you know, my ideas and listen to the ideas of the people that were in the group in my native language.
That's interesting. Anouk, isn't that where translanguaging comes from, where you have proficiency in both languages at a certain level where it makes sense to switch languages?
Yes, indeed. Translanguaging, this is indeed what you're saying. It's not just translating, it's using competences in both languages, exactly how you were describing.
Okay, what can someone tell me what kind of things were mentioned by people that teachers should absolutely learn in order to be able to work along these lines? What are the most important things, Laura?
Well, we talked about how they need to learn skills to foster interactions between the children who are bilingual and monolingual.
And what kind of skills would those be?
Just pro-social skills, empathy.
Uh-huh.
Oh, and I wanted to compliment the ladies in my group. They were Spanish speaking and they did an excellent job speaking in English. They were worried about their English, but they did an excellent job.
Well, there you have it. Anxiety in speaking the majority language. There you have it. I see Ivana nod. It's recognizable, isn't it? Yeah, so this is another hands-on experience with the relevance of translanguaging as
yes, I felt bad that I couldn't speak Spanish, but they really did a great job. So
Okay.
I want to compliment them.
Okay, very good. Thanks. Anyone else?
I think in our group, we talked about just along the lines of what other people have shared, the kind of psychological aspect of language acquisition and the things that teachers can do to normalize difference and language diversity, by having children share words, how they would say something in their own language, but making sure that they have, pictures and images of children and their families and their home lives in the classroom so that children feel represented and seen and celebrated in the classroom. But I think we also, in a kind of note of some desperation, recognize that that's all great, but it's also not sufficient to help children maintain their home language or advance academically in their proficiency. And so I don't think we got anywhere with a solution to that, but just recognizing that while it is a big step to help teachers actively and intentionally recognize and support language diversity in their classroom by having children, use language in the way that they feel comfortable, by asking about it, by showing curiosity, and then by really, bringing in visuals and parents. It still is not going to, if your goal is to develop some kind of bilingual fluency, it will fall short of that, because without really deliberate instruction and for children to understand, how their language skills support their English, and then also how to just, advance it academically, how to learn skills in their language, that piece won't happen.
Thank you. I think this links up, Anouk, with one of the debates that you mentioned about the goals. What are the goals of translanguaging? That's where you have to start, isn't it?
Yes, and this is a very difficult part of it, because I think one of the goals of translanguaging is also just to remove stigma in some way and encourage also parents to use that home language and read in the home language, because it's not something to be ashamed of, and it is actually very useful to learn and develop the home language. And then indirectly, maybe the home language gets better. But at the same time, they don't learn it in school, as also Sarah Schott said, and it's a bit sad in a way, or it's hard to organize this, that they also learn reading and writing in a systematic way as they learn the language of schooling.
Thanks. Okay, Catherine, your hand has been up quite a few times. Tell us what kind of comment do you have to make, or what kind of experience do you have to share?
No, I don't want to share experience. I want to make a point. And it's actually a point that I think ties back to what Erica was talking about. I mean, why is it that children in Spanish-speaking homes in South Florida end up speaking English better than Spanish? Why is it that many such children actually end up speaking rather poor Spanish and never having literacy experiences in Spanish? It's because children are exquisite sociolinguists. They learn very early what languages they really need to speak and what languages they can get away without speaking. And so we can't ignore the relative sort of status and power differentials between languages. So yeah, you can launch an early bilingual program in the Netherlands where people have lots of access to English on television, and every time they travel more than 300 kilometers in any direction, and where it's a very high status, where there's a very high status language. But it's quite a different situation to learn English. We were talking with Lucy Zalayo in Peru, where English is much less available and much less necessary. So I think I certainly would, I'm really glad that Anouk brought up these points about translanguaging as a social support, but that doesn't mean you can then use whatever language the kid speaks and the teacher speaks not very well as an instructional language, because there are academic and complex topics that need to be addressed that can't be addressed with partial language proficiency. So that's all. I have argued this with Ofelia Garcia quite a lot. She is quite resistant because she lives in a world where everybody's bilingual in Spanish and English, and most of us don't live in that world.
Yeah, I think you would fully agree with that, wouldn't you, Anouk? I mean, this is really, of course, one of the main things. Yeah.
In a classroom where kids speak maybe over 15 languages, to share instructional content in all the languages, that would be impossible. It's
impossible. You always have the instructional language as the basis for everyone. Renata, you want to make a point?
Yes, thanks. I think maybe it's ask a question. I think this, translanguaging is obviously such a current issue in so many contexts. And at the policy level, I've seen a mess when every teacher has to figure out policy issues in their own classroom, right? Very confusing. They don't have the basis to do that. So I'm wondering what, perhaps Anouk and also Erica, what would be the policy, or what would be the recommendations that you would give to teachers about the use of another language in the classroom period, during classroom instruction specifically, or at school, and how would you clarify that to teachers?
I think one very important thing is to be open to other languages and to have this mindset that home languages are something nice that can be very useful, and that it can also be very useful in learning, especially when a heritage language is stronger than the language of schooling. But at the same time, that it is something that you maybe need rules about, like sometimes maybe have translanguaging hours or translanguaging days or project weeks, and that it super depends on the context, like I also said before. But the small steps are always possible. Making languages possible, talking about languages and maybe sometimes compare languages. So this mindset is something you can do everywhere, and then how exactly and how much and when, this depends then on the school and also the teacher, the confidence of the teacher with letting go control. Some teachers maybe really like to play with this and other teachers a bit less.
Well, to the extent that my research equips me to have anything to say about this topic, I would say that we should not discount the importance of proficiency. So children are probably pretty good at figuring out if their teachers speak Spanish or Arabic or whatever their home language might be. And there's no sense in pretending, in the teachers pretending that she speaks a whole lot of languages that she doesn't, or that she will do badly. So I would argue against the idea that teachers should try to teach in their children, in their pupils' home languages if it's not their language. Now, that's not to say that it can't be fun for children to bring in their home languages and share them and show. I was telling my group, I remember in school, a student brought in, presented a poem in Spanish, and it was beautiful. And before that, the Spanish I heard was just kids yelling on the street. And so to hear beautiful Spanish really made me have a different attitude towards Spanish. So I think you can bring in those bits of your culture and those bits of your language and share them with people and enjoy it. But that's very different from saying that instruction can happen equally in all languages, regardless of proficiency. That I think would be a mistake.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Renata?
No, I think those are the issues. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, I think this is a good moment to try to wind up things. With specific thanks, of course, to Erica Hoff and Anouk Tichlover for their presentations. They were really inspiring. Thank you so much for joining us today. We know that bilingual developments differs from monolingual development, and that this comes with specific difficulties, but we don't yet know enough to have a clear-cut pedagogy that really answers to all the problems that may occur. But I think it is clear that translanguaging offers potentially solutions to really existing problems. And maybe at this point, we need ambitious teachers and ambitious researchers that are prepared to try ideas out in their practice and in their research, because without trying, we won't gather more evidence about the efficacy of these approaches. So hopefully this meeting has inspired some of us to take a few steps in that direction. And I thank you very much for being here, for joining us, for sharing your thoughts also in the breakout groups. And we hope to see you again at the next ProLear talk, which will take place on the 5th of August. And the speaker there will be James Kim from Harvard Graduate School of Education. And this will definitely be a very, very interesting meeting. So you're all invited to sign up, and I'm sure you will receive an invitation for that. Erica and Anouk, thanks again. Sorry,
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much indeed.
We'll take just a minute to actually mention that James Kim's presentation will be on July 8th.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay.
So we may want to resend out the calendar, but thank you so much for announcing that ahead. And this has been a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody. And
thank you everybody.
A lot of inspiration in your work. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.